Welcome to AgriTalk and thank you for keeping it KTN Farmers TV. Today we are talking about agriculture and the environment, and with me is Claire Nasike, who is a food campaigner at the Greenpeace. Welcome to the show, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Greenpeace as a food campaigner.
Well, I work as a food campaigner at Greenpeace Africa, and my role involves advocating for smallholder farmers, basically around ecological farming, carrying out trainings on ecological farming, and also getting them informed on some of the agricultural policies that currently exist in Kenya.
Okay. Why agriculture and environment? Why do we need to have this conversation?
We definitely need to have this conversation about agriculture and environment because of the negative effects that agriculture has on the environment. So we're looking at things such as clearing of forests to pave way for agricultural activities, and that's really essential for us to have this kind of discussion.
Okay. But as the population grows, something has to give. So do you think we may need, what do we need to do to make sure that we feed the growing population
I think we can
without
do it sustainably.
impacting the environment?
We can do it sustainably. So population is not an excuse to degrade the environment. I believe we can do it sustainably, and that's why we have something called sustainable agriculture. Yeah.
Okay. Apart from deforestation, what are the factors that has agriculture impacted on the environment?
Aside from deforestation, we have soil, we've got water resources, we've got microorganisms in the soil that are essential in food production. Insects such as, or microorganisms such as earthworms, most of these are harmed by the use of chemical pesticides. So we're looking at various things when it comes to agriculture and environment and the impact agriculture has on the environment.
Okay. Maybe you can expound a little bit when you talk about land degradation. How has agriculture led to land degradation?
In terms of land degradation, agriculture has led to that. I'll begin with soil first.
Yeah.
Soil, because of the increased use of chemical fertilizers. So in soil, there's something called soil pH. So the soil pH could be acidic or basic, or could be neutral. So because of the increase in the usage of chemical fertilizers to grow food, and most of the farmers that use these chemical fertilizers do not do soil testing prior to the application of these chemical fertilizers. So you find that most of the time the soil then becomes acidic because of the over-application of these chemical fertilizers. And what then happens is that the soil environment is not conducive then for food production, because now those microorganisms that would have thrived at a certain pH are not able to thrive when the soil is too acidic. So that's one form of degradation when it comes to agriculture. The other form is also water resources. Water is needed for us to be able to produce food. But then if the water is consistently contaminated by either heavy metals or by chemical pesticides, then that water is not good enough for food production. So if it has chemical pesticides, and depending on the chemical properties of these chemical pesticides, some of them are not broken down, like they do not degrade in the water or in the soil. So that means that when you use this contaminated water to grow food, then the food that you're growing or you're consuming after harvesting, that food has elements of pesticides and some of these heavy metals.
Okay. When you talk about the water, does agriculture also either pollute the underground water or in some way?
Yes, it does, and it pollutes the underground water aquifers through leaching. So you find that either some chemicals, like the pesticides, for instance, they're able to move from the top layer of the soil and deep in to the deeper layers of the soil. And so once they move, then that way they're able to contaminate some of the underground aquifers. And this is also entirely based on the properties of the pesticides or the chemicals that are being employed in agriculture.
Okay. What about biodiversity? And what does exactly biodiversity mean?
So when it comes to biodiversity, agriculture has an impact on biodiversity as well. So biodiversity, you just mean plants that exist on a farm, microorganisms or the animals that you would otherwise see in a natural environment or in a forested environment. So that's what we're talking of, like when we mean biodiversity. So agriculture has an impact on that biodiversity. For example, if we were to clear down a section of, let me use Mau Forest. The biodiversity in Mau Forest is rich because the forest is natural, it's not man-made. So you'll find some indigenous tree species, you'll find some microorganisms that thrive in that sort of environment. So when we clear down that forested area, then that essentially means that we are messing up with how that natural environment operates. So we've taken away some sort of biodiversity. The birds or the bumblebees or the earthworms that depended on certain types of trees then are not essentially there. So you're messing up with the local biodiversity of a certain area. So that's how agriculture affects biodiversity. Also in terms of the soil, we have soil microorganisms we call, that are key in food production that reside in the soil. So when you start using chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides, then essentially that means that you are messing up with how these microorganisms work. You find that earthworms are key in the soil when it comes to making holes within the soil, aerating the soil. So when you continuously use chemical pesticides, then you are interfering with the earthworm population within the soil that are key. Then that means that your soil is not aerated. So if the soil is not aerated, then water is not able to percolate through the soil, so that you find that your soil is consistently, what's the word I'm looking for? It's consistent, it's not able to hold water properly. Yeah, so consistently waterlogged.
So when we talk about land degradation and all the things that you've mentioned on what agriculture has done to the land, I'm still trying to wonder what ways can we, I know you had earlier talked about we can grow a crop sustainably. I'm still trying to wrap my head around sustainability of growing crops to feed all this population without really having an impact on the environment.
Okay. Sustainable agriculture is possible, and it's possible if we have the political goodwill, like in terms of policies that are enacted to support this sustainable agriculture. So sustainable agricultural practices are several. There's organic agriculture, there's ecological farming, there's permaculture. There are myriad of them. Sustainable agriculture can actually feed the population without harming the environment. So that means that we are not using some of the chemicals that are employed in food production. For example, in industrial agriculture, there's a heavy reliance on chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers to produce food. And then there's also the monocultures. You know, you're pushing one kind of crop, so you want to grow maize, you're pushing the production of maize at large scale, and that has detrimental impacts on the environment. So sustainable agriculture looks at things such as intercropping, whereby you're growing several crops together, and the importance of this is that then you don't have to use chemical fertilizers to enrich the soil. So you can intercrop one crop variety with another one that is key in adding nitrogen to the soil. So you find crops such as leguminous crops are key in adding, fixing nitrogen into the soil. So you can choose to do intercropping of maize and beans, or no, if not maize, then you can choose to use tree species. We've got tree and shrub species that are also key in fixing nitrogen into the soil. We've got tree species such as Tephrosia vogeli, that's the poison bean tree. We've got tree species such as Sesbania, all those, and Phaidabia albida. All these are kind of trees that can be used in enriching the soil. So, and they are used in sustainable agriculture. So instead of you being dependent on chemical fertilizers, then you're making the switch to natural alternatives that are locally available and easily accessible by local farmers. And it just doesn't end on intercropping alone. There's also something called integrated pest management, whereby farmers can actually use biopesticides or natural ways to control pests. And this can also be mixed, so you can use biological control or natural ways. So you mix these two and you're able to control pests and diseases on the farm. Yeah.
When you talk about agriculture, it's not about just crop production.
No.
There's also animal production. Is there a way that also the production of animals is also affecting the environment?
Yes, there is, and I am an agroecologist, so I speak most about plants, not more about animals, but I can lightly touch on it. So animals also have an impact on the environment. I'll take an example of cattle. When they are grazing, the impact on the soil, formation of hard pans and all that. So they have an effect on the environment. So grazing them consistently in one area is likely to alter the state of the soil, so which leads to degradation. So that's why we're told zero grazing. You have to alternate the grazing patterns of some of these animals from this area to another area. Then you allow vegetation in that area to crop up, or you minimize the amount of hard pans that actually form in a certain area. So there are several practices that are being implemented in terms of also animal production to minimize the impact on the environment.
When it comes to water resources, the amount of water on Earth has been, especially fresh water that can be used in our farms, has been reducing over time. What can farmers do to make sure that the little that we have is not contaminated beyond our reach?
In sustainable agriculture, there's something called agricultural water management. So this essentially means that you only use water where it's needed. And aside from that, there's also several practices that make sure that the amount of water you use in your farm does not go to waste. So we've got practices such as zai pits, which are basically pits you dig. And then these sort of pits, you can plant crops there. And I think one zai pit takes about 6 or 9 crops, thereabout. So these zai pits, you only water the crops within those zai pits. And because they're deeper and you've put in manure, you've put in dry grass, so these zai pits are able to retain the moisture for a longer period of time. So as opposed to just watering a section of the land that has crops, when using zai pits, you're able to know that I'm watering this crop, and this water will be utilized here within this space. So the little water that you have is not wasted. The other thing also is planting certain kind of crops. Let's say, for instance, drought-resistant crops. You know that this kind of crops will need water between this period and this period, and afterwards they will be fine. So you are making that shift and knowing you have little water. What are some of the practices that you can put in place to make sure that the water you have available serves the purpose, and the purpose here is food production.
Okay. We've seen an increased push for farmers to grow hybrids, and in the process we've neglected our traditional crops. What impact is this going to have?
I think the impact the cultivation of hybrids
and GMOs
and GMOs has had is that these crops are not locally adapted. They are not acclimatized to the local conditions that we have in our country. So for farmers to cultivate this kind of crop, then that essentially means that they're going to use more water, because if they were, let's compare, for example, that farmers are, before we used to have finger millet, we used to do sorghum, but then farmers have shifted from that. Now they're moving towards maize production, and they have hybrid varieties such as Duma and all those other maize varieties. So the thing is, millet you would plant during the rainy season, and it will be able to reach maturity with minimal water. But for maize, it will get to a point where it will fail, and particularly the hybrid maize, where it will fail. So that means that farmers have then to turn to either irrigation, either you look for other sources of water, or you will not have food. And that's the danger I was telling you initially about growing monocultures. You're growing one type of crop. So when this crop fails, then that means that your household has no food whatsoever. But now when it comes to sustainable agriculture, we encourage cultivation of several crops on a farm. So if you're growing finger millet, you're growing maize, you're growing cowpeas, you're growing sukuma wiki, you're doing spinach. So in the event that one of these crops fail, then your household has food. Yeah, and the crops can fail due to various reasons. You know, we've been experiencing long drought seasons as compared to the previous years. So this could be one of the reasons why crops can fail. So if they do fail, you are guaranteed that you have at least planted one indigenous variety that is able to withstand this drought season. So you at least have food for the next couple of seasons before the next rain season.
Okay. There's something also I was reading on they call plastic culture, whereby
Plastic what?
culture.
Culture.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
plastic culture, whereby farmers these days use plastic sheets to cover. I think you've seen them in greenhouses.
Yeah, the black plastic sheets.
There is a black one and there is still a transparent one.
Yes.
And then they just make small holes and then they plant their crops on that. What effect can such kind of farming have on the environment?
First of all, I believe the farmers who use that, they do that to minimize evaporation.
Evaporation, yes.
So the effect that can have on the environment is that plastic releases chemicals when exposed to sunlight. So these sheets could actually release either dioxins or whatever that plastic sheet has been made of. They could be released into the environment, and they could also have an effect on the soil. So if they're released, then are they getting into the soil? Are they getting absorbed by the crops? Where are they going? So that could also have a harmful effect to crops and the soil and the air in general.
Okay. What about its effects on a microorganism in the soil?
The effects of the plastic sheets on microorganisms in the soil is that you see, most of them, they use the black one. I'll speak about the black one because that's what I've seen before. And this black one, you're basically minimizing the movement of these earthworms in the soil. Aside from minimizing the movement of these earthworms in the soil, is that you're preventing the release of heat from the soil, and this can actually affect microorganisms. You see, the way human beings, we suffer from when it's too hot, you feel like this is too hot, I need to go and sit under shade or stuff like that. So the same happens to microorganisms. If it's too hot, then you're reducing the amount of heat that is supposed to be released from the soil. Then these microorganisms are likely to be affected. So their functionality is also altered within the soil.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about global warming and climate change? How has agriculture contributed to global warming and climate change, and how has that translated to environmental degradation? Or what impact has it have on the environment?
When it comes to global warming, there are several gases that lead to global warming. So we're talking of methane, we're talking of carbon dioxide. So methane mostly comes from agriculture, cattle, and all that. Agriculture has contributed to the release of this because you find that, let's speak about Kenya, for example. The kind of farming that we do is that we keep cattle, and then we have to till our land every season. So when we till our land, remember, we are releasing some kind of gases, and these gases that are released from the soil, carbon is released from the soil and it goes into the atmosphere. This contributes to global warming because it's one of those gases that contribute to global warming, which is just the rising temperatures. So tilling of the land, continuous tilling of the land, keeping of cattle, which are part of agriculture, all these have contributed to global warming. But now, what have these rising temperatures, what has been the effect of these rising temperatures? You find the effect has been flooding. We're talking of varying climatic patterns. We are not sure whether we'll have rain. For example, this year we did have very minimal rain. Which is unlike the previous years. So those are some of the effects of this varying of the rising temperatures, which we call global warming. So we could have floods this year, we are having droughts, or we're having typhoons and tsunamis. All those are some of the impacts that arise from agriculture.
Okay. What about the control of pests and diseases by the farmers? Does this also have an impact on the environment?
Yeah, the control of diseases using pesticides has a massive impact on the environment, and one of it is contamination of soil, and the other is contamination of the air and contamination of water resources, and which are actually two things. Soil and water are really critical in food production. So if the soil is contaminated, you find that some of these pesticides, because of their nature, either they stick to the soil or they leach into the underground water aquifers. So if they stick to the soil, it means that this pesticide is going to be around the soil for a number of years. And it's just not about pesticides alone, herbicides, insecticides, all those pesticides that are used by farmers. So it depends on their property. But most of the times we find that most of them are either left in the soil or they leach into the water resources. And for those ones that don't leach, when it rains, they're washed off into the water systems. So then that means that there's the cycle of contamination continues. It started by spraying, then it ended into the soil. From the soil, now it was washed off into the river, or either it leached down into the soil or through to the aquifers. Yeah.
Okay. All these things you've told me, all this information, where can our farmers get them from? Having in mind that some of our farmers are not really educated, how do they get some of this information, and even how can they break it down to something that they can understand?
Greenpeace Africa has been doing an excellent job training farmers on this, basically teaching them about the impact of their practices on the environment, and particularly water and soil, because this is what is key in food production. We also have a booklet that we call it a trainer's handbook. So this handbook has all this information broken down in a language that the farmers can understand. Aside from Greenpeace Africa, we also have other various organizations such as BioVision Africa that are doing an excellent job training farmers on sustainable farming practices that are able to help them grow safe food for themselves, but then also safeguard the environment for future generations.
Okay. Do you think also governments are doing enough, both the county and the national government, in trying to educate farmers to understand that by protecting the environment, they're also safeguarding their future?
I don't think so. I don't believe the government is doing enough to educate farmers, particularly on sustainable agriculture and the impact of their actions on the environment. This is because when about 2019, when we were visiting the farmers, most of them will tell you that either they've not seen agricultural extension officers, they just hear about those officers existing, but they've never seen those officers visiting their farms. So I don't believe that the government is doing a good job when it comes to educating farmers on the impact of their actions on the environment. And aside from that also, I think the government has a key role to play when it comes to ensuring that whatever the farmers are doing is safe and it's beneficial for not only the farmers themselves, but for the consumers as well. And this could be in terms of policies whereby the government could regulate and say, we would like to set up a sustainable agricultural policy, and this policy will ensure that the way food will be grown in Kenya is by no pesticides, or banning some of those pesticides that are harmful to human health, or the pesticides that are harmful to to the aquatic organisms in the water bodies, or pesticides that they stay long in the soil, like the word I'm looking for is I've forgotten the word, but anyway, yeah. Yeah, they stay in the soil for a longer period of time.
Okay.
Yes.
Talking about governments, and you've talked about policies.
Yes.
Do we have any policy that is even trying to protect the environment, in that we are only interested in policies when it comes to crop and food production? But I'm not sure if we have enough policies that also go to protecting the environment.
I don't think we have any agricultural policy that protects the environment in Kenya. We are doing a pathetic job at that. Most of the policies that we have in Kenya, and I speak of strategy documents such as the Agricultural Sector Transformation strategy document that I think came into implementation in 2019 and goes for 10 years till 2029. When you look at that document, you see that it tends to lean towards industrial agriculture more than sustainable agriculture. And the reason I say that is, from the statistics, we know that 75% of the food we eat today is grown by smallholder farmers. That's about 75%. So they grow this kind of food on their small pieces of land. It could be 1 acre, 0.5 acres, all those kind of, little land that they have. But now when you look at strategy documents such as the agricultural sector and transformation strategy document, it talks of shifting farmers out of farming into more productive jobs. And then someone could ask, what could be more productive than farming? Because already these people are feeding us. They're feeding the Kenyan population. They're feeding the same policy makers who are implementing a document that wants to shift them out of farming. But then a closer look, you get to understand that farming is productive for the smallholder farmer, but not the large industrial farms that want to capture agriculture. So then they enact policies through our policy makers, through funding and all those kind of things. They enact these policies then to ensure that they have a space, but then the farmers are kicked out. And how do they do that? They come up with punitive policies. Recently we had the Livestock Bill 2021 that Kenyans were outraged by, that looked at barring people from keeping bees unless you're registered by the Apiary Act. We have laws such as the Seeds and Plant Varieties Act that states that you cannot share seeds if those seeds are not in the variety index or the national list of seeds. So if you're found sharing those seeds, then it becomes an offense and you have to pay a fine. So if you're going to make farmers pay 500,000 Kenya shillings for just sharing seeds, or not even sharing seeds, we had also the Irish potato regulations that were looking at criminalizing the growth of potatoes, in the sense that if you are a grower and you're not registered, then you have to pay a fine, and you're growing that scheduled crop and you're not registered, you have to pay a fine or you're imprisoned. So it's through some such kind of laws that the government is making farming unproductive for the smallholder farmers. So you couple that with the strategy document, the one the government is calling the agricultural transformation document. You couple that with one of its aim is to shift farmers out of farming, then you're essentially looking at they've put these policies in place so that then they can shift these farmers out of farming, because eventually farming will be expensive. If you can't share seeds with your neighbor, which has been happening since time immemorial, we've got those indigenous seeds that have been shared by my grandparents, probably your grandparents if they were farmers, but now it's criminal to do that. Then farmers will not find farming attractive anymore. So then that essentially means that the arable land that the farmers were growing food on will be left bare. So then these multinational corporations or these large agricultural industrial farms can come in and occupy that land. Obviously, they can try and push for the removal of impediments that exist within them owning land in Kenya, because most of the land is community owned. So if we can remove impediments from this owning land, the community land, and then we make it private land, and then we can use this land to grow food, and then we sell this food to Kenyans, then they are making a killing, but the farmers who are once feeding us are not making a killing. And that has an impact on the environment, because most of these large-scale industrial farms, they push for monocultures. They push for the continued overuse of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. And that can only boil down to Kenyans consuming food that is laden with chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers, talking of heavy metals, all those kind of chemicals that are detrimental to human health.
Okay. We'll take a short commercial break, but when we come back, we'll continue with this conversation. For viewers back at home, today we are talking about agriculture and the environment, but now we're just going to take a short commercial break, but we'll be back shortly.